Hello and welcome to the channel, where today we're going to look at the 8 things you need to think about in your movement phase. I'm joined today by Maxine again. How are you, Maxine?
Hello Ed, I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me again.
So today we're talking about probably the most important topic you can have in Warhammer 40k, in my eyes, which is the movement phase. Doesn't matter how good your army is, doesn't matter what the stats say, if you've got movement, there's a lot you can do. So, Maxine, you recently made a post about this on your Instagram, which people can go check out. The link will be in the description. And so we thought we would talk through the 8 points that you consider when you get to your movement phase.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to reiterate how important the movement phase is and how key it is to winning games, because you're right. It doesn't matter how good your army is or how strong it is. If it's got the biggest and best guns in the world, but it can't see what it needs to shoot, you've moved in the wrong place. If you've got the strongest combat piece on the board and you're about 30 inches away from where you need to be, it's no use. So movement is very, very important. So as you said, there are several points that we can consider when going through the movement phase to try and help make it less of a minefield for us, because you have infinite options in your movement phase. It's now about how do you focus it down to help meet your goals.
I will just say that when we talk about considering your movement phase, it's important to start this process in your opponent's turn if it's a tournament, because you're in a timed environment, right? And so you need to start thinking, right, where's my opponent? You don't want to leave all of your decision making to your turn, ideally. So, Maxine, where do you normally start, right? What's the first things you start thinking about?
First thing I have is a grand design of how I want this game to go. Not just in this current turn, but turn 2, turn 3, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? It's that kind of question, right? Where do you see this battle going? And this is something that could change turn on turn. It doesn't have to be something that's completely fixed. It can be dependent on how your opponent reacts to your first move. But a general concept of where you want things to go. This could be, for example, I want to control the entirety middle of the board in one big flat line. I've got a very big tanky Deathwing army, for example. I just want to push up slowly and hold this line. It could be a scenario that you've got a very fast, hard-hitting army. You want to push a certain angle or a wedge into your opponent through a very specific direction on the battlefield. And it's how do I work towards that? So having a goal in mind, just very high level, about what you're trying to achieve in the game can help you start putting some of your later plans and movements well in advance.
Yeah.
So it's only very, very top high level first thing to consider.
Yeah, I generally refer to this as kind of your strategy. Nick talked to me about this when he came on the channel. So your strategy is kind of your top level overall plan for the game, and then tactics are your kind of smaller individual plays and decisions that you're going to make. Brilliant. So where do you go to next?
Yeah, so once I've focused that down, I start thinking, right, what is the game state we're currently in? By this I mean, am I net up on points? Am I in a precarious board position, for example? Am I in a position where, yeah, I'm up on points, but I'm losing models fast? Am I in a position where I'm really trying to hammer home the game? I'm up at ahead in points, I've got a strong board position, my opponent's on his knees. Am I looking to push things? And why this is important is it helps you to understand whether you should take risks or not take risks. So this makes you understand whether you should be going for more advanced plays or rolling the dice on 50-50 plays, or whether you take something that may not necessarily net you more points, but will guarantee you holding some points.
Yeah, the aggro, I think, is one of the things it's often called in kind of just gaming generally. Is do you need to be the person that's changing things up now, right? If things stay the same, or at least let's just say you're trading a unit every turn, those middle objectives, if you just do that, are you going to win? If so, then feel free to just keep doing that. Leave it up to your opponent.
Exactly, but if you're finding yourself needing to make a 10% play just to get yourself back in the game, sometimes you've got to do what you got to do, and therefore your movement is then dictated by that aggression you need to show.
Always worth going for those plays when you got nothing else to do, and it's part of the fun of the game, right?
Yeah, exactly. When it pays off, great story.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it doesn't pay off, great story. So, okay, interesting. So we've got our overall strategy of what we want to do. We know whether we need to make the moves or whether we don't. So then what are we going to look to now?
The next point you kind of look at is where you're going to score the bulk of your points. That is through scoring primary. And by doing this, you need to take objectives and also deny your opponent primary. So this makes up 45 points of your entire game. That's 45% of the total points you can score during the game. This is a great place to start focusing on how you're going to win some of these points. To do this, there are a certain number of objectives on the board. You can't hold all of them, and you can't take all of them, and sometimes you may be just trying to score as many as you can. That could be 5 primary points, 10 primary points, or the full 15. But it's making sure you pick your battles. You can't hold all of them. And also, how are you going to take away some of these points if you get the opportunity? So it's really trying to manage, yes, I can take all 4 of these points, for example, but can I hold them? If the answer is no, do you need to get onto those points? Are you denying anything from your opponent? No. Am I going to be holding them? No. So why not keep your resources back?
I like that a lot. I think that also fits really well into your first point there about kind of your overall strategy, because the other thing you need to think about is what are you going to do the next turn, the turn after, and onwards, because it's really important to remember you're not just holding objectives next turn. If you're taking a unit out of action this turn because you know that's going to be getting you your objective 5 or 10 points or sometimes 15 points. We know how these games can go. That's what the top players do. They will hold units back even if they're not doing anything turn 1, turn 2, because they're worth 10 or 15 or so points later on, and that's a massive deal.
It's managing your resources, exactly. Anyone can pile all their units onto a point turn 1, win 15, and suddenly they go, oh, I've got no units left. I can't hold any more primary for the rest of the game. So it's really trying to manage that as you go through the game. It may mean scoring not 15 in the first few turns, but if you can win that war of attrition, sometimes you can get more of those points later on. So it's just learning to pick your battles and when to pick your battles.
It's vital for some armies, right? If you watch any of the streams of the top Drukhari players, exactly as Maxine says, you never see anybody commit all of their units in the raiders up turn 1, because what Drukhari win at is they win at saying, okay, let's play this war of attrition, as Maxine mentions, and then it happens that they've got, let's say 2 witch squads left over towards the end of the game, and that's where they rack up those points.
Yeah, it works really well for really efficient armies and efficient units, just because they will have the extra resources as the game runs deep. When you, for example, you need to throw your army up and actually do a bigger dent is when you've got less efficient units, because then you need to do that early damage first to get yourself in a higher points position in terms of the number of assets you've got on the board. So there are times to consider going a bit more all in for the point of killing, but by and large, yes.
And when we're looking at objectives, I think it's really important to talk about trading and just explain quickly what that is, because it's a term that's thrown around quite a lot. And what we're primarily talking about here is what are we losing in order to take away from our opponent. And the reason this really matters is because a common mistake that I'll see is somebody will move, let's say, their 5-man Deathwing blob onto a central point turn 1. And they've also got in their army, let's say, infiltrator squads or tactical squads, whatever it's going to be. And the reason this is a mistake is because in those early stages of the game, your opponent has got all of their assets. So if you put the Deathwing blob on, and Deathwing are tough to kill, they're still going to die. They're not impossible to kill. And so what would be a much better play would be to move those infiltrators forward. You need to contest that objective, then you should do so, but send forward the easiest to kill unit first so that you lose that one, and then as the game goes on, your opponent's resources will have been lessened, so their shooting will have been lessened, and at that point, when you move your Deathwing on, your opponent won't have the resources to remove them just as easily, or they'll have to contribute all of their resources to it. So it's about limiting what our opponent can do there.
Yeah, it's a concept of trading up. So you throw on your 10-man cultist squad. They then throw on a 5-man Space Marine squad. They can kill the cultists quite effectively. You then bring in, say, your 5-man Berserker squad, slightly more effective, slightly more point costed, will kill the Space Marines. They then send in their Terminator squad. They easily kill in your Berserkers, and then they'll try and hold on to that point, and then you bring in your Red Butcher Terminators that will kill their Terminators. It's that concept of, I'm going to deny you this point. I'm not necessarily expecting to hold this point, because you're just going to come in and deny me right back. And the point that you mentioned at the start is someone's having the mindset of, I'm going to hold this point, but I'm not putting enough into it. And then that concept you start trading down, because you're starting to think, I'm going to try and hold this point with my 5 Terminators. they're not necessarily going to keep it. You've not thought that they're actually going to hold it, because you don't really want to be trading down. You don't want to be losing your Terminators at the wrong time too early without any point gain, because you moving them onto the point has gained you nothing.
Yeah.
They've taken you off the point, so you're not getting victory points. You've not denied them any primary points because you've just put them on that point. Or you could have taken them off with something a lot cheaper.
And so, onto the fourth point, which I can see is about secondaries.
That's correct. Yeah, that's the next part where you're trying to score your points. It's 3 blocks of trying to score 15 points. So again, worth 45 points. So understanding how you want to move in order to ensure that you're going to score these points is very important, particularly around a lot of secondaries that are around being positioned on the board in certain places, whether that's stranglehold, engage, needing to actions in certain part of the board for rod or those kind of secondary objectives. It's very important to have in your mind how you're going to move to ensure these secondary objectives are scored, not just for the current turn that you're in, but often to stage to get ready for the next turn.
Yeah.
So, where that's important is, for example, if you're scoring engage for 3 points this turn, that's great, but when they kill one of your assets deep in their lines, do you have an option to kind of get engaged next turn? Or are you going to be losing those points? Do you need to stage to get there? Or for rod, for example, you need to be 6 inches within each different quarter, right? How are you going to move to ensure that you can get past those thresholds to get rod into the quarters that you need at the right times?
Quite a common one I'll have is that there'll be 2 quarters left that I need to do rod in, and the reason I haven't done them is because I can't fit into those quarters. So what I need to do is rod in 1 quarter this turn, but I also need to kill what is currently screening me out of the other quarter so I can do it my next turn. I also think this is also a very good segue to talk about something that we mentioned in the last video, and it kind of proves this point, because one of the things I'm sure you'll have picked up on already is that there's a lot of things to think about. And in the last video, me and Maxine talked about stacking secondaries and stacking secondaries with the primary, and this is why it's so important. The reason it makes such a big difference on you as a player is because it means that you have less decisions to make. Because if you've got to hold the mid board, let's say 2 more objectives and get engaged, that's way more decisions when it comes to your resources. So that's why those kind of secondaries are really important.
That's right, and if you get those efficiencies as well with terms of scoring your secondaries and stacking your primary, you can also do the same with your movement. So one of your movements will not only score your primary, but also score your secondary, and also prepare you for later secondaries. Like, you can do one movement and it can cover lots of different bases. It doesn't have to be one or all or one or either. It can do both, so those efficiencies are great.
So I've given that example there of rod, where sometimes we need to make sure we are killing something in this turn to make sure we can score rod next turn, which leads us quite nicely onto the 5th point, which is all about that. So what do we need to kill or tie up this turn?
Yeah, exactly. So now we've covered what our strategy is, what our goals are, and we're kind of moving to think about how we score these points. It's now your opponent is also doing the similar things and they were trying to stop you. The next thing to consider is, what units do I need to destroy from my opponent or tie up to ensure that the goals above are being met? Whether that's your grand strategy for where you see in 2 turns time, whether it's making sure you hold an objective, whether it's being able to be able to do your next rod by killing what's in front of you, right? Let's put an example out there. You want to hold a specific point. They've got a blade guard squad standing right on it that are just going to kill whatever you bring into that kind of sphere of influence. So how are you going to hold that point? You need to remove the blade guard squad. So how am I going to move my resources to not only get onto that point, make sure I remove the blade guard squad, and make sure that the squad that's now left on there is protected? So quite often you need to kill something to do that, and then also potentially tie something up. That could be something as simple as tagging a tank, or getting something in combat that can't necessarily fall back and shoot or charge. It's that kind of focus on your player's asset.
Yeah, and to that point, I think one of the things I really love about the order of the considerations that we've talked about today is that it's only at this point that we're actually talking about killing things, right? Because too often when you're new to 40k, you end up committing too much to killing things and not nearly enough about actually scoring those points, whereas it's a really good mentality to get into in Warhammer, to start off your turn thinking, right, how am I going to score these points, and then start thinking about what you're going to kill.
Yeah, exactly. As a World Eater player, I totally get that mindset. It's always very tempting to run those berserkers out there and go absolutely ham on opposing units, but sometimes it's worth just keeping them in that rhino one turn longer, use the extra movement on a rhino and just move them to a different part of the board where they're needed more to score points, and let other assets deal with something that may potentially not need to be killed this turn to actually change anything about how you're scoring points or the game.
And interestingly, as we're talking about destroying and tying things up, I think another thing that you'll see people consider much more at high levels of 40k is that when they're moving, they're also thinking about the charge phase, they're thinking about their consolidations, thinking about their pile-ins, because this is a whole chunk of movement that you've got access to, and it's a really important thing to consider. So this doesn't mean to go for 12-inch charges just to get onto those points, but if you can make a reasonably short charge, so a 7 or less is generally recommended with a reroll, then you can get that 7 inches, then you get that 3-inch pile-in and 3-inch consolidate. You're moving pretty far, and it's important to remember that you've got that movement, so consider that in the back of your mind. And again, it's one of those things that as you get more comfortable playing the game, feel free to play into.
Yeah, definitely. I think with charging, you don't have to move towards the nearest enemy unit. You could charge 12 inches in a complete beeline in the wrong direction as long as you finish in engagement range. So if you roll a big charge, it can get you onto a point that's almost completely the wrong direction, but as long as you finish in engagement range, you've got that extra movement to get to an additional point, to snag an objective, to tie something else up.
In terms of thinking about what do you need to kill this turn, it's really important to remember that if you can tie something up this turn, you don't necessarily need to kill it, because it's not going to do anything next turn anyway, so you've bought yourself that time. So concentrate on what you do need to kill.
Very true. You think of Hive Guard for Tyranids, sometimes you tag those, it's as good as killing them.
And so then on to point number 6. So this is interesting because you've dedicated an entire point to talking about characters. So why have you done that?
I've done that because characters are a little bit more nuanced than your actual units, because often they'll give you benefit auras. Sometimes they activate in a command phase, sometimes they're just generic auras that are following them all the time, for example. Likewise, they often have character protection, so when they're within a certain distance or near a bigger unit, they can be protected from enemy fire. Therefore, they have a bit more nuance in terms of how you need to move them to get the best out of them. But if you do it right, you can get a lot out of them. For example, Khan in World Eaters, if you're within 1 inch, and it's 1 inch only, you get full rerolls to hit both in shooting and in melee. That is huge. On a group of obliterators, for example, it can be genuine game changing if you got the movement of Khan right to be within that 1 inch. Now, when you're thinking about how you want to move your characters, you've got to think about the goals we've previously discussed and how are they going to support you in getting those goals. Are they going to be creating those auras? Will they be providing heroic intervention ranges? I think it's a very important part of the game, and if you get this kind of movement wrong, your buffing characters can go down like a sack of spuds, and you'll feel pretty silly if you're an admit player and you've just lost all your characters.
Oh yeah, 100%. I think you've talked there about like a bunch of little things that really stack up. So heroic interventions are absolutely massive. That what heroic intervention does, if you put a unit into heroic intervention range, if you're new to 40k, then what this will do is this will force your opponent to change what they were going to commit to destroying that unit. And what you want to do is give your opponent more and more limited options, and that kind of thing is a really good practice to get into, because when it does matter, it can have a huge effect. And then point number 7 is about terrain there. So what kind of terrain pieces are you looking to see, Maxine? What kind of things do you normally try and play around?
Yeah, so now we've kind of discussed what we're trying to shoot, how we're trying to use our characters. It's now, how do we get the most out of what the actual board looks like to ensure that you can use it to maximize your goals, right? So a lot of the things I'm trying to look for is obscuring, line of sight blocking terrain. Breachable terrain is very important for my army because it's very infantry heavy, and it should be important to any army, just because if you've got vehicles that can't go through this breachable terrain, you need to plan around that. Terrain is often a very important part of any board, particularly in the modern competitive scene. We're seeing more and more terrain being added, and let's be honest, a terrain-filled board looks so much cooler, so learning how to make sure you interact with this stuff to maximize your goals is important. So For me, when I'm looking at terrain, as I said, I'm looking for that obscuring, line of sight blocking, to make sure that I'm hiding or away from my enemy, but also have the ability to set traps for my enemy. I run a very close combat focused army, so how am I going to ensnare my opponent? Well, it's by making sure that they can't see me. They have to come towards my threat ranges to get to me, so I have to use terrain for that, and being able to come out from terrain at the right times. And to minimize their sort of shooting output on you, whether it's by leveraging dents, whether it's obscuring, whether it's cover, it's how do I move to get that? If I just plonk them out in the open, I may as well give you my units.
You can see on the screen now the GW terrain, and I think the reason I thought this would be good to just show was because what you can see here is how you can use the terrain in terms of the other points that we've talked about today. So we've mentioned a couple of times now about how you might want to hold units back, and a classic unit that people would do this on is something like Vanguard Veterans, just a jump pack infantry unit. And the reason this works very well is because, as you can see on the screen, there's a lot of ruins in the GW recommended terrain pack. And that means that infantry can hide pretty easily. And what people often will call it is, they call it springboarding. So you're going to have the Vanguard Veterans deployed all the way back here, and then turn 1 they're going to move and advance, turn 2 they're going to move and advance, and it's turn 3 that they're going to get that reliable charge into combat. And it's that point that they'll be, threatening objectives or whatever it is that you need them to do. And so it's all about putting all of these things together. And terrain is often one of the biggest considerations in how you should be moving your models.
Very true.
And then the final point that you've put here, Maxine, is how can you affect your opponent? How can you control their options?
Yeah, this is something I have in my brain as I'm going through all these other points. It's very important to remember you're playing an opponent, just like a chess match, right? You're not just playing a list, you're not just playing to your own strategy. Your opponent's going to be trying to do things as well. They're going to try and trap you, they're going to try and play to their objectives. And it's about trying to make sure you move in such a way that you're dictating the terms of the game. Now, this is a little bit more complex and nuanced, and it's very hard to articulate. But some of the kind of things that you need to keep in your mind is your opponent's threat ranges. If you just walk straight into their opponent's threat ranges, you kind of playing to their game, right? If you keep out of their threat ranges whilst also managing what you're trying to achieve, then you're bringing them to you. You can then control how they have to move in their next turn to be able to counter what you are doing. And additional ideas, if they've got deep strikes or reserves, make sure you have these in your mind as you're moving. Because if it's really important for them to do their 2 rods and they're at deep strikers or their reserves, the only way for them to do it, how can I move to stop that? I can do that. That's something I can do if I've got the assets to do it. If I'm playing Custodians, maybe a little harder, but usually you'll have the option to be able to control that. Then they have to bring their reserves on at a different place, and their battle plan's been jarred. And suddenly you're playing to your strategy, rather than what they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, pre-measuring is so important. If you look at those top 40k players on stream, you'll notice just how long they spend pre-measuring. We were talking at the start of the video about how this is really important because even if your army is statistically disadvantaged, you can even the playing field by being really clever in the movement phase. So for example, if you've got 75% of the shooting output that your opponent has, then you can even that out if you can stop some of your opponent's units from getting into range of yours. But I have got to say, likewise, it's really important that you make sure you know what your ranges are, because too often you see people place something like a dreadnought behind a big line of sight blocking piece of terrain, and then they can't move out and get line of sight and range on the things they need to get line of sight and range of. So do just be mindful of that.
Yeah, and I've got 2 points to add there. Number 1 being 100% do not be too defensive. My theory is always being that if I've got nothing left on the board, or if I only got 1 or 2 things left on the board, everything's kind of done its job. If I'm sitting back there with 3 Hellbrutes and a Rhino and full of Berserkers, I'm thinking, could they have done something more to score me more points? Probably. So I should have probably used them. The second point being is your opponent may have the ability to move into all their threat ranges, so they may be able to threaten everything on your board. They could be fast, they could be scary like Jakari, but one thing you can control with your movement is what can they actually go into. That can be creating effective screens. It could be giving them another threatening asset that's not necessarily scoring you points, but is scaring them. It's distraction card effects, if you will. it's something that they'll look at and go, I need to take that down, otherwise it becomes a threat. But it's not something that's necessarily scoring you any points. So something that may be more valuable to you might be your cultist squad standing on a point that's also doing an action. That should be what their priority to kill is. But in reality, you throw a Hellbrute into a certain position, it might just readjust their focus. So again, it's playing the player. If you know you're playing a really aggressive player that just wants to take you down, sometimes you can manipulate that a little bit.
I think one other thing I just wanted to mention that I think fits well into point 8 is about movement blocking. This is something that I really recommend you try doing as you're getting more comfortable playing the game of 40k, because I love to move block. So as Gene Stealer Colts, I have quite a lot of things that can do this. I have big infantry blobs that can block things. I have quite big footprints on my vehicles and they're quite cheap, so I'm happy to throw them away. But there is a huge deal. So I think, a classic example, if we look at the terrain in the GW map, what we can see here is that there's some quite thin gaps between some of these terrain pieces, and things like vehicles and monsters, they can't move through walls. So if I put my truck here, that means that this vehicle or truck is going to be slowed down. I think if you've got something that's really fast, a massive thing you can do is try and slow things down in those early turns, and this will be a really big deal if you can put that pressure on, or prevent your opponent from coming out, so that you rack up a lot of points early on.
Yeah, 100%, because you've got forward deployment units as well, infiltrating units. These are other units that are great to get up there, block these sort of avenues that you can see created on the board. And what this can do for your opponent is it stops them from just simply charging with like a 3-inch charge onto a point, or walking onto a point just to take it off you. It enforces them to actually shoot past this screen or psychic their way past this screen, and then a longer charge to get to where they potentially want to go to. More importantly, they probably won't be able to do that, which then again brings you back to controlling the game and your opponent, forcing them to be able to play to your game.
And that wraps up this video on things you should consider in the movement phase. As usual, I hope you found this really useful. Let me know in the comments if there's anything else you'd like to add. Thanks to Maxine for coming on. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you for the next one.